William the Conqueror and the Norman invasions of England. William the Conqueror was a man who would live in a time that would come to contain many events that would change the history of not only England but of the territory that surrounded it, changing the lives of many in numerous and different ways, and leaving an impact that would go on for decades and centuries after the event. Several individuals would be affected by the numerous events that would occur during this time, including battles that would go down in history as history-defining battles, with lots of things depending on their outcomes, sieges that had massive impacts, and interactions, negotiations, and meetings that would determine the fate of millions. We will spend time exploring these events. William would live to make a massive impact on England and its future, as well as the future history of Normandy and of Europe. He would become Duke of Normandy in 1035. In England, with the death of Edward the Confessor, William would move to invade England with a Norman army, an event that would contribute to the start of his own reign. He met several challenges throughout his reigns. His maneuvering around these challenges would come to define some of his successes as a leader and as an individual. His rivals would include personalities the likes of Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada, and the later parts of his rule would be characterized with struggles and uprisings in several regions of the territory he would come to occupy. In this podcast, we will explore his life story, taking a look at the factors that made William the way that he was, including a look at some of the challenges he would face and how they would contribute to the eventual development of his legacy. We will also take a look at the events that surrounded the Norman invasion of England, looking at the power struggles in Normandy and taking a further look at the uprisings he would come to face and encounter as ruler of England, and some of the rebellions and power clashes that would come about. Some time will also be spent exploring the changes that would come as a result of his rule in England and some of the events that would follow his death, looking at a timeline of his life as well as events that had occurred before his reign. William had been born in 1028 in Falaise, Falaise being in the Duchy of Normandy. His wife would be Matilda of Flanders, and she would continue to be mother to several of his children, including William II as well as Henry I. She continued to have some influence on some of the events that would occur. His father had been Robert the Magnificent, and his mother Herleva. 1027 would see Robert his father ascend the throne as Duke after Richard III, his older brother, amongst some level of controversy. Amidst some suspicions, several parties would be vying for several sorts of power during this period, but Robert would be able to gain support during the tumultuous time as well. 1035 would see several events, amongst them would be the death of a significant one. It also saw journeys and a change in power. It saw Robert go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The pilgrimage followed some changes he had made in property that would concern and benefit the church. But prior to that, he had undertook actions that helped to support William's claim to heir. Robert would not make it back to Normandy as he would die on his way back. This left the young William as the heir to the throne. Certain factors would arise that made William's childhood challenging and difficult, including issues of his birth, power struggles amongst several parties, and other issues. William was very young at the time, but his ascension to the throne would have supporters. Gaining full control of the throne would be a process that would take a long period of time. 1037 would see several events, including the death of Archbishop Robert, great-uncle to William. Archbishop Robert had played a role during his rise. His death would have an impact on events that would occur during that time. Power struggles would also emerge like they had before, and would see several changes in the custody of the young duke. These changes would occur several times over the years. Many years would pass on with events of their own which would affect numerous people in numerous ways. 1046 would see opposition to William arise. Guy of Burgundy would be one of the leaders of the opposition in rebellion. He was a relation of William, but he wouldn't be alone in this rebellion as several other people would join him. Events would eventually see William flee. 1047 would be an important year that saw many changes occur. It would see an important battle in the form of the Battle of Valais Dunes and the return of William to Normandy. The battle would have an impact on the reign of William and would change things somewhat. It had involved forces of Henry I as well as forces of William, and would occur in Normandy. It resulted in a victory for William and Henry's forces. It would also see the defeat of the Norman rebels. Several factors would play a role in the outcome of the battle, amongst which would be Ralph Tessin and his forces. They would come to fight alongside the royals. Another contributor to the result as well was the difference between the quality of leadership on both the sides. Years of conflicts would follow, however, which would see many events occur during that period. Some of these events would have an impact on the overall period. 1049 saw marriage between William and Matilda arranged in the Council of Reims. 1050 as a decade would see him married to Matilda of Flanders. It would also see the exile of the man who was a relation of William and had also been a leader of the rebellion against him, Guy of Burgundy. 1051 would see the death of Hugh IV of Maine. He had been the Count of Maine for more than a decade during his life. The general period also saw the exile of Godwin. 1052 saw Godwin's return to England, and his lands would eventually be restored. In the following year, in 1053, Earl Godwin dies, which would have some ramifications. His sons gained more influence. He had reigned from 1020 to around 1053 as the Earl of Wessex. He had wielded large amounts of power and would continue to play important roles in events during his life. He is succeeded by Harold, his son, who would eventually rise to the throne of England. Tostig, another son, would become Earl of Northumbria, rising to this title around 1055. His daughter Edith is at some point in time the Queen of England, as she is married to Edward the Confessor. 1054. Invasion launched against the duchy. Some events would occur through the county of Évreux, and some of the events would occur in eastern Normandy. The invasion was by King Henry and some Norman rebels. Events around the invasion would see the participation of individuals like Robert, Walter Giffard, William de Warenne, and other individuals. These individuals would be in support of William and would play their roles in their different ways in the events that would come to unfold during this period. Battles like the Battle of Mortimer would also occur during this time. This battle in particular would be won by the force on William's side. Other events would occur, and one in particular would concern an archbishop who would go by the name of Archbishop Mauger. The resulting events would see a change in the position that he occupied. The period would be important in determining the future of William and his relation to power in the Duchy of Normandy. It had seen some fighting between some of the forces present. In the course of events, some notable individuals would be captured in an event that would involve numerous individuals. 1057 would be marked by yet another invasion, this time by Henry and Geoffrey Martel. Battle of Varaville would occur during this period and would result in victory for William. It would ensue sometime around August and would come to involve numerous individuals. Edward the Exile, or Edward Atheling, goes back to England. His son is Edgar the Atheling. Edward dies at some point in time during this period. Edgar's family had played a role in England for decades before him. Some of those who had come before had been kings of England. Edgar's grandfather had been Edmund Ironside. 1058 would see several events, some of which would concern William. It saw Tillières-sur-Ever and Themert taken by William. Amongst some of the events that had occurred over the course of the year or the general period would be the commencement of the siege of Themert. Some of these events would see the direct involvement of Henry. Events here would at times see the presence of individuals, the likes of Count Ralph IV of Valois and Count Theobald III of Blois. 2 years after some of the events of 1058, 1060 would see Count Geoffrey die, which would have impacts on William and his power. He had been Count of Anjou for a long period of time and had been involved in conflicts with William. King Henry also dies in the same year. 1062 and the general period around it would see expansions into Maine by William and would also see the death of Count Herbert II of Maine. This would be followed by several changes that would concern Maine and William. The two events that had occurred in 1062 would be linked, and William would claim a stake in Maine, which had been a neighboring county of Normandy. Maine would later on, and long after the events around the Norman invasion of England, be invaded by Folk-Lorican, leading to conflicts between forces under William and those under Folk. Other events around Maine at other times would involve other actors, the likes of Hubert de Beaumont of Maine, which would lead to conflicts between him and William. These conflicts would involve a long siege and end in William's success. Fulk had been the successor of Geoffrey III to the Countship of Anjou, and he would reign for decades, eventually dying in 1109, 1064, invasion of Brittany by William. Some of the events that would occur around this event would benefit William in some ways, and would have some bearing on the later invasion of England that would follow a few years later. 1065 would see events occur that would have widespread consequences, including the exile of Tostig and the emergence of a rebel favorite in the form of Morcar. A revolt in Northumbria would take place. Morcar would emerge as the rebels' choice to replace Tostig. The rebels would be supported by Harold. 1066. King Edward dies early in January. William would be amongst those who would claim rights to the throne in England. And the period that followed would be characterized by conflicts to establish who would gain the throne. Several other individuals also claimed the throne. This included Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada. As Edward the Confessor lay dying, he would apparently name Harold Godwinson as the next king. But William had a counterclaim on the issue, arguing that the throne had been promised to him by Edward. The 6th of January would be a momentous day that would see the crowning of Harold. The southern coast of England would be the site of several attacks by Harold's brother Tostig. He would be supported by a fleet from Baldwin of Flanders. Other regions and sites during these events would include Lincolnshire. By the end, Tostig would find himself in Scotland after the events that had occurred. William would make preparations for an invasion over this general period and in the time surrounding it. A fleet would be built by William as well as by Harold. St. Valery-sur-Somme would be the point of departure, and the force would be made from individuals from several places and regions. Some of the regions and people would have a significant stake in the coming events. Several factors would come into play into William's decision of when to land the force. On the other hand, Tostig and Harold were not lying idle and had made inlands into Northumbria in the general period. There would be conflicts between them and Morcar and Edwin. 1066 would see the Battle of Fulford, which would occur in Northumbria and would see the involvement of several forces. The end result would be victory for Harold and Tostig, who had joined forces. The events would also result in some changes in territory, including those in Fulford. We will explore some of the events in the battle here. Battle of Fulford, 20 September 1066. The fighting here at the Battle of Fulford would occur sometime in September. It would end in the defeat of the English forces that were present. Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia would be present, as well as Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson. Harold Hardrada was claiming the throne, and he would arrive in England with numerous forces in support. Prior to the battle, January had seen the death of Edward the Confessor and the rise of Harold Godwinson to the throne amidst several challengers, amongst whom was Harold Hardrada, William, Duke of Normandy, and Tostig Godwinson. In the past, Tostig would have battled Edwin the Earl of Mercia separately. The events of the battle: the English would make moves to protect their flanks. The position they would occupy would have certain disadvantages. The English forces would attack, and the fierce fighting would be filled with maneuvers and other moves in order to achieve the best results for either side. At some point in time, the English forces would be split from each other, and several fronts of battle would occur. The outcomes of the fighting was the victory of the forces under Harold Hardrada and Tostig. The surrender of York would soon follow, followed by other events like the Battle of Hastings. The River Ouse had been a significant location or marking for the battle that would occur. In the previous part, we looked at the life of William the Conqueror and took a look at some of his early days as well as some of the history of the battles that had taken place. In this part, we will continue with the story. 1066. Battle of Stamford Bridge, 25 September 1066. The village of Stamford Bridge would see the momentous and important battle that had the fate of England riding on it. It would also result in the end of the aspiration to the throne of several individuals. The month would be September. Events had been moving at a steady pace towards the events that would unfold here. King Edward had died, and King Harold had ascended the throne. Several challengers would arrive onto the scene, amongst whom were Harold Hardrada. The waiting troops of Harold Hardrada and Tostig would at some point be surprised by the English troops. The events that would occur at this battle would determine the future of thousands, and would go down in history as a history-defining event. The battle would see several individuals, amongst whom were Harold Godwinson, Earl Morcar of Northumbria, and Earl Edwin of Mercia. They would be on the opposite side of Harold Hardrada, Tostig Godwinson, and others. Harold Hardrada was the king of Norway. He would amass several ships under him and make his way to England. Along with the ships were thousands of fighting men. Some of the men who would eventually find themselves in England had made their way from Flanders, and some of them had been from Scotland. Along with Harold was Tostig Godwinson, who had been Earl of Northumbria before, and was the brother of King Harold. As they made their way, they would be involved in a conflict with forces that were led by the Earl of Mercia, Edwin, and his brother. From this exchange they would be able to achieve victory. It was in the aftermath of these events that the Battle of Stamford Bridge would occur, with King Harold and accompanying forces coming from southern England, making their way over the large journey to reach the forces of Harold Hardrada and Tostig on the battlefield, arriving somewhat as a surprise. Apparently, prior to the battle, Tostig would be tempted with an offer that would have seen him gain his earldom back. Now made aware of the English, the forces under Hardrada would make some preparations. Delays would occur, however, in the English making their way to the forces under Hardrada. Fierce fighting would follow, lasting for a long, protracted period. At some point in time, the shield wall which had been formed by the forces on Hardrada's side would weaken. Tostig and Hardrada would fall and more losses would follow. Eystein Or would at some point in time make his appearance on the battlefield. The Norse would be forced by events that had occurred on the day into fleeing, overcome by the forces of King Harold. The losses on their side would be massive and a truce would eventually be made. Ships would eventually return to Norway, and changes would occur back home in the wake of the death of Harold Hardrada. The Battle of Hastings would follow the events here and would see a change in the fortunes of King Harold. Some of the events that had occurred here at the Battle of Stamford Bridge would play a role in the events that would ensue. That same September would also see William and the Norman army make landfall at Pevensey Bay. Base would be set close to where he had landed. Harold, at the time of the landing, had just seen the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the preceding days. In the general period would split his forces, some remaining with Morcar and Edwin while some would travel with him. Of note, William's choice of position had several considerations in it. With some of the contenders of the crown in Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson dealt with at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and with the threat of Norman invasion. Events would see forces under Harold and Harold himself travel from where they had been, splitting the army between those who would stay in the north and those that traveled with him, moving some considerable distance in a move that was an answer to the threat of invasion by the forces of William. Harold had consequentially found himself deprived of some of his army. A surprise had been amongst the intentions that Harold had had, but factors would deny him that opportunity. The fate of England was on the line, and battle was on the books. Senlac Hill, the position Harold would choose to take, would be mere miles from the one that William had chosen. The events that would occur soon after would see fierce fighting with many casualties and forces driven back. Several notable individuals would also perish, and some territorial gains would occur in its aftermath. Harold would have the initial advantage, and the course of the battle would initially be in his favor. Some of William's troops would flee as the trend of the wars went awry. But the pursuit wouldn't be without hitch, as pursuer would at one point in time become the pursued as tables turned and casualties would emerge on the side that initially had been pursuing. In the course of the battle, the English would be drawn in a few times by fleeing Norman troops, but this would be a strategic move by the Normans. The day was the 14th of October. Fighting would go on for hours, and several events would occur over the course of the notable and significant battle that had the fate of England and all her lands riding on it, as well as the fate of Europe in history. William would emerge victorious. Amongst the dead of the battle would be Harold and some of his brothers. Following the Battle of Hastings, several events would occur. For one, Edgar the Atheling would be nominated for king. Responsible for this would be individuals, some of them from the English clergy. William wouldn't be entirely idle. He moved to secure territory in the time following the battle. Amongst that territory would be Dover. Winchester would also be an area that he would secure as well. We will look at a deeper look at the Battle of Hastings. Battle of Hastings, October the 14th, 1066. Fierce fighting, thought-out strategy, and history-defining events in the aftermath of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. 1066 would see the momentous conflict within England between the Norman and English forces. A fierce battle that would be remembered in history and brought up, discussed, and studied. The battle would occur around October and would see several individuals who would play different roles. Amongst those was William, Duke of Normandy, William Fitzburn, and Eustace II. These were on the Norman side. On the side of the English would be individuals and leaders like Harold Godwinson, Gyrth Godwinson, and Leofwine Godwinson. The fighting would be fierce and difficult and would see several losses in a brutal clash between the forces that had been gathered there. Many things would change in the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, including several changes in the leadership of England and in the relation of the English population to William of Normandy. However, rebellions would exist years after the events at the battle. William would also travel to other locations, passing through areas like Southwark. The battle would occur on English land and would see a battle between the Norman French forces who were under William the Duke of Normandy, who was challenging for the throne, and English forces who were battling with King Harold Godwinson at their helm. Prior to the events that would occur here, several changes had occurred in England, including a struggle for power that had arisen in the wake of the death of King Edward the Confessor, who had been king in England from 1042 to around 1066. He was son of Athelred the Unready. His reign as king would be relatively a long one, stretching more than 2 decades. Several events had happened in his youth within England, including invasions, and the throne would see several occupants during that period. Athelred would die in 1016. Edmund Ironside would enter the scene, and conflicts between him and Canute, who was son of Sven Forkbeard, would occur, but Edmund would eventually die in November of 1016, leading to Canute holding the throne. Edward would go into exile, and an attempt would occur to return him to the throne. After a while, and after several changes in who held power in England, he would become king in 1042. By the end of his reign, the succession to his throne would be in question. Enter the events that follow and the jostling for power that occurred with them. September of 1066 would see the arrival of William's forces. Their arrival would occur at Pevensey. Harold would eventually make his appearance on the scene along with his troops. After the death of Edward, Harold had been crowned as king but had faced several challenges from individuals like Tostig and Harold Hardrada. The fighting between the forces under William and those under Harold would be fierce. The force under William would have consisted of individuals drawn from France and from Normandy, and preparations for invasions had taken a while. When they eventually arrived, they would spend yet more time building some fortifications. The force under William would consist of various individuals, some of whom were part of the cavalry and some part of the infantry. They would be adorned with armor, some of it modified to allow easier riding. Some of the individuals would carry shields. Javelins, long spears, and swords would also make their appearance. The fighting would be fierce. The fighting would occur possibly within a region that had a marsh close to it. Leading some of the divisions of William's army would be individuals like Alan the Red, William Fitzburn, and Count Eustace II of Boulogne. Fighting would start early and would see arrows sent over to the English forces, after which spearmen would be deployed. Several attacks would occur from the English, and a counterattack would eventually see the involvement of William. Many events would occur during the day. Ultimately, Harold would fall, after which the English forces would disintegrate, and some would flee, pursued by the Normans. At the battle, several others would fall, including King Harold's brothers Gyrth and Leofwine Godwinson. The battle would go on to be remembered in history and would be remembered as a momentous event. After the events, William would finally reach Southwark and would eventually cross the Thames in December. He'd received the submissions of several important individuals, amongst them were Edwin, Morcar, Stigand, and even Edgar the Atheling. Most of them having played a role in the events that had occurred around this period, and having been friends, allies, or at least associated with King Harold. In that year, Westminster Abbey would then see him crowned. Several important events and considerations would follow his crowning. Some of it would involve the powerful and very powerful within the realm. Land would be gained for some people whilst it was lost for others. Marriages, the confirmations of some earls, and the transfers of land would take place. A few of those who had been against William would have their land taken from them. Amongst them would also be the family of Harold, events that would have some bearing on their lives. William would delay the return to Normandy due to a few considerations, but by March he would be able to return. And some important and influential people in William's camp would be left with considerable power when he returned to Normandy. Amongst those people would be Odo, half-brother to William, as well as William Fitzosborne, who had played a role in the events that had preceded this one. Along with him as he journeyed back to Normandy would be Stigand, Morcar, and Waltheof amongst others. His absence, however, would be marked by several events including English resistance, sometimes in the form of a man called Edric the Wild. Hereford would also find itself attacked in this general period amidst other events that were occurring. In addition to this, an attack on Dover would be made and eventually fail. The attempt had been made by a man named Eustace, who had been involved on the Norman side in several events during the Norman invasions and had contributed in some ways. Revolts also occurred in Exeter, so that when William returned in December of 1067, he would travel there. Sons of Harold in the meantime were active and found themselves undertaking several raids on England's southwest before facing Eadnoth. Other events that had occurred had also involved Githa, who had been mother to Harold. She would continue to play a role in some events in the wake of her son's death. 1068. Revolts, castle building, and a king's return to Normandy. 1068 would see a revolt by Edwin and Morcar, who had earlier in the reign of William surrendered to him and had been confirmed in land and title. Events would see the involvement of a man by the name of Gospatrick, who would be the Earl of Northumbria. King William responds. General period would see the building of several castles, amongst them would be Warwick, Nottingham, and York, and would also see the submission of Edwin and Morcar. Other castles that would be built or would be commenced would include Lincoln, Huntingdon, and Cambridge. The lives of several individuals would be affected by the building of these castles, and several men would be put into roles where they would be in charge of some of the fortifications or castles. Other events would also find themselves occurring during this period. Some of them would be relevant to King William. 1068. Return to Normandy and Siege of Exeter. Siege of Exeter. The event followed several events including the Battle of Hastings, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and the Battle of Fulford. At the Battle of Fulford, the fighting had occurred in September and had ended in the defeat for the English forces present. Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia had been present, as well as Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson. Harold Hardrada was claiming the throne, and he had arrived in England with numerous forces in support, also consisting of several individuals and forces that had been gathered by Tostig. Prior to the battle, January had seen the death of King Edward the Confessor. In past events as well, Tostig would have battled Edwin the Earl of Mercia previously. Over the course of the battle, the English would make moves to protect their flanks. The position they would occupy would have certain disadvantages. The English forces would attack, and the fierce fighting would be filled with maneuvers and moves in order to achieve the best results for either side. The surrender of York had soon followed by other events like the Battle of Hastings. In the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the village of Stamford Bridge would see the momentous and important battle that had the fate of England riding on it. The month would be September. Fighting would be fierce and would see several figures fall, amongst whom were Tostig Godwinson and Harold Hardrada. The losses on their side would be massive, and a truce would eventually be made. Ships would eventually return to Norway, and changes would occur back home in the wake of the death of Harold Hardrada. The Battle of Hastings would follow the events here and would see King Harold fall. With his fall, William would eventually be able to claim the throne. Now the events at Exeter would occur following all these. They would also occur with William now on the throne, but resistance still existing in parts of the country. The Siege of Exeter would occur in 1066 and would see the involvement of Githa Thorkelstoter, who was mother to Harold Godwinson. Several events had occurred in the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings. some of which would include what would happen to soldiers that William had sent to England, and what he would find out about Exeter and the happenings around and surrounding it. Githa had fled to Exeter, and it was increasingly becoming a region of relevance to the resistance. William would act to respond to the combination of some of these events, including a response to a demand of fealty that he had issued, and would maneuver his troops towards the city. He would come to interact with several individuals that had made up a delegation from Exeter as he got ever closer, and they would offer him submission. The gates of the city would, however, remain closed to him when he made his way there. A siege would follow, during which several events would occur, including the flight of Githa and some of her supporters, and losses suffered by William's forces. Eventually, the gates of the city would open to him, and conditions would be accepted by the city. Githa would also eventually find herself leaving England, after which her return to England would never come about. She would come to find herself spending time in several other locations. Other events would occur in its aftermath, some of them involving Harold's sons. 1069 to 1070 and the general period would see several revolts, one of them, a revolt in Le Mans. An event which would have a bearing on the future and would see the involvement of William in the year that followed. The period also saw the rise of revolt by Edgar the Atheling. Edgar would continue to play a role in some of the events that would follow. Some of the happenings would also see the involvement of King Sven. During this period, York would find itself attacked. King Sven and Edgar would join forces. Other happenings would also occur, like ones that would see Exeter and Shrewsbury attacked by King Sven's forces. In the course of the period, York would fall, and at some point in time Edgar's supporters would proclaim him to be the king. A continental revolt would also happen in Maine, and Edgar would flee at some point, but Waltheof and Gospatrick would submit to William. Events would occur and would see the remainder of the rebels defeated. The general period also saw Chester and Stafford castles built. During Easter Court, William would be ceremonially crowned, and Stigand and Ethelmar would lose their bishoprics. Some other events would also occur during the event or in the general period, which would also see several other individuals and abbots affected. General period would see Lanfranc made new Archbishop of Canterbury instead of Odo, William's half-brother. Some thought and consideration had been made in relation to this move. The court would have ramifications for several of the abbots and bishops, and the general period would also see Battle Abbey founded. Sven would return to England and raid his way through in the direction of the Isle of Ely. Events surrounding him would also involve a person by the name of Hereward the Wake. Peterborough Abbey is attacked by Hereward. The event would have a bearing on the abbey. Sven is dealt with by William, the same Sven who had been involved in events at Shrewsbury and Exeter and had been involved in other events as well. Count Baldwin VI of Flanders dies in July, and a conflict about succession arises. He had been Count of Flanders from 1067 to 1070. Parties that were involved in the issue or had a stake in the outcomes included his widow, who would go on to propose a marriage to Fitzesbern. Her sons, and Robert, a brother to Baldwin, are amongst other individuals involved or with stakes in the matter. 1071 would begin and see events like the Battle of Cassel, which sees the death of Fitzesbern. Fitzesbern had been an important supporter of William, and the man that would replace him wouldn't be. Other events would be Earl Edwin's death. A causeway would be built by William. And at some point in time, the catching of Morcar would occur, as well as his eventual imprisonment. Morcar having been a key individual in some of the events that had occurred. He had been involved in the Battle of Fulford, along with his brother Edwin, and had been Earl of Northumbria. 1072. The year would see individuals the likes of Malcolm involved in events, and would also see events occur in Scotland and a treaty that would have some territorial outcomes. William would emerge the victor in a clash with Malcolm, as several events would see William enter and invade Scotland. The period would also see the Treaty of Abernethy between William and Malcolm, which would come with territorial gains in Cumbria. Malcolm was the son of Duncan, and several events had occurred during his life, including notable battles. 1073, William returns to Normandy. He gains Le Mans. William's hold on northern France is bolstered during these events, and Folklorican would be involved and play a fairly significant role in some of these events. King Philip I of France is also married to Bertha, a sister of Robert. England briefly sees William's return, and after he leaves, some of his supporters are left to manage England, once again similar to what had occurred before. His absence from England is relatively long. 1074, Scotland sees Edgar the Atheling once again. 1075, Ralph de Gale and Roger de Breteuil, Earl of Norfolk and Earl of Hereford respectively, are involved in the unsuccessful revolt of the Earls. With Roger in Herefordshire and Ralph in Norwich Castle, Ralph leaves England. The period would also see the surrender of Norwich, which would have some consequences. England would eventually see the arrival of a brother to the Danish king in the form of a man called Canute, but his arrival wouldn't be permanent as he would find himself once again headed in the direction of home. Normandy is left for Matilda to manage as William returns back to England. 1076, of sieges, battles, and injuries. Several events occur involving various people. One of these events sees the execution of Waltheof in May. Another would see the castle at Dole laid to siege by William. Other events saw a battle occur which King Philip of France wins and William loses. Some events would occur in the general period, and at least one of them would see the involvement of Count Folklerican, who had been involved in several other events in the past, playing a role in some of them. He would be wounded at some point in time. 1077 saw peace between Philip and William eventually secured, as well as between William and Count Folklerican. But issues would start piling up for William as around this period, a feud between family would see Robert, his oldest son, face his father. Robert would leave Normandy. Other individuals would also be involved in some of these events. Things, however, would not end here. Events would also see the castle at Gerberoy given to Robert by King Philip, after several events that concerned Robert and the people that were with him. 1079, sieges and raids. Gerberoy is besieged by William, a siege that would be eventful in some respects. William narrowly escapes death, siege is lifted. The period also saw raids by King Malcolm of Scots, which would involve numerous individuals. 1080. William and Robert come to an agreement around this general period. Walker is killed after a rebellion rises against him. Walker is a bishop of Durham. Odo is sent to respond to the rebellion. He is half-brother to William and had played a role in several of the events that had occurred during the life of his half-brother William. But in at least one point in time, he would become a prisoner. 1080 would also be significant for some of the raids by Robert that would come to involve Lothian. 1087. William's death. Several events would occur following his death, with his sons receiving some territory. Normandy would be given to Robert, and William would receive England, but conflicts would occur between the brothers, and would also see battles like the 1106 Battle of Tanchebray. End of the timeline. Over the course of events, several individuals would play significant roles. Amongst them would be individuals the likes of Harold Hardrada, Tostig Godwinson, and several others. We will spend a short time exploring part of their stories. We start with Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson would be the King of England reigning from January to October of 1066. He would be involved in several events including the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which would see the fall of Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson in a fierce battle. He would also be involved in the fighting at the Battle of Hastings, which would see him fall. He was the son of Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, and Githa Thorkelstoter. After his death, she would be involved in several events like the Siege of Exeter, which had seen the arrival of William at its walls, and had eventually seen the escape of Githa and her departure from England. Events would also see Exeter surrender. Harold Godwinson's father would be a powerful man in many respects. His daughter would be Edith of Wessex. Godwin would also gain acclaim in an expedition to Denmark, which he had gone on with Canute. He would still be alive when the sons of Canute would take the throne. Harold would have several siblings, amongst whom were Sven, Tostig, Wulfnoth, Geirth, Edith of Wessex, and Leofwine. At some point in time, he'd become the Earl of East Anglia. At another point in time, he would gain some of Sven, his brother's lands, after he was exiled. His life would also see him at times command ships that were involved in the conflict between Henry III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Baldwin V, the Count of Flanders. He would eventually succeed his father as Earl of Wessex on the latter's death. He would gain other positions as time went on, being involved in some of the campaigns and conflicts against the King of Wales. At some point in time as well, he would possibly find himself captured and taken hostage by Count Guy I of Ponthieu, though the events that had surrounded his journey in the first place had remained somewhat unclear. His reign would be filled with several challenges to the throne amidst the ambiguity of succession that had followed the death of King Edward. He would eventually die at the Battle of Hastings. Harold Hardrada. Harold Sigurdsson, or Harold III of Norway, would be born around 1015 in Norway. He would be involved in several key events throughout his life, being involved in the conflicts around the succession of the English throne, which would see him involved in fierce conflicts like the Battle of Fulford and the Battle of Stamford Bridge. His life before his ascension to King of Norway would see him participating in several other conflicts and occupying several roles, amongst which was a period in which he acted as a mercenary. His father was Sigurd Syr. At some point in time as well, he would be involved in a conflict against the forces of Canute the Great, along with his half-brother, a conflict that they would lose. He would pass through several regions including Asia Minor, Constantinople, and Kievan Rus. Some of his exploits would be met with success that would yield him wealth. Throughout his life he would have several children, amongst who were Inga Gerd, Maria Haraldsdottir, Magnus II, King of Norway, and Olaf III. In his role as King of Norway, he would be followed by his son Magnus II. As King of Norway, he had reigned from approximately 1046 to 1066. He would become a co-ruler with his nephew Magnus I until Magnus' death, which would occur in 1047. As a ruler, he would make numerous changes. He would also carry out raids on Danish land. Alongside Tostig Godwinson, he would be involved in several conflicts in England, including the Battle of Fulford and the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and he would ultimately fall at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Olaf Haraldsson would be half-brother to Harold Hardrada. Tostig Godwinson. Tostig Godwinson was the son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex. He would have several siblings, and his life would see him involved in several conflicts, taking part in many of them. Some of them would include the Battle of Fulford and the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Battle of Fulford was a battle that would occur around September of 1066 and would see Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson emerge with the victory against the Earls Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia, who would be present, along with the forces that would be with them. He was a brother to Harold Godwinson, who in 1066 had risen to the English throne amidst several other challengers to the throne, and whose reign would be short. At some point in time in the past, he and his family would be banished from England and would seek refuge before once again returning. Tostig would also at another time become the Earl of Northumbria, a role which would come with some challenges. He would apparently be unpopular among some of the people that he would come to lead, and some of his actions would add to this. He would eventually find himself outlawed. He would seek the refuge of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. Tostig would also find himself involved in raids in Norfolk and Lincolnshire. And at some point he would be involved in a conflict with the Earls Edwin and Morcar, a conflict that he would lose. He then joined forces with King Harold Hardrada, who was King of Norway, who had been involved in several conflicts throughout his life, at one point in time acting as a mercenary. The father of Harold was Sigurd Syr, and then Harold would pass through several regions throughout his life including Asia Minor, Constantinople, and Kievan Rus. Harold would find himself in a conflict against Canute the Great, a conflict that he would lose. As King of Norway he would reign from 1046 to 1066, and would make several changes throughout his reign. Tostig would be involved in the fighting at the Battle of Stamford Bridge and at the Battle of Fulford. The Battle of Fulford would see him win against the Earls, but this would be followed by a loss to King Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, during which he would fall. We will end the story of William the Conqueror and the Norman invasions of England here. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Also check out some of the other episodes on the channel.